Good morning or good afternoon to you all and to our audience. My name is Eline Chivo and I'm Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, a think tank based in Brussels and in DC and that focuses on tech policy. And today I'm speaking to you from Brussels. First of all, thank you all for joining us to discuss how the Digital Markets Act could reshape the EU's digital economy. I will first introduce our guests before we dive into the conversation, and as there may be more time for Q&As from our attendees, please do go to Slido as a participant and join by using the hashtag EUDMA to post your questions. Feel free to tweet as well using our handle and our hashtag data innovation. To set the scene first, just a few preliminary remarks about what we're going to discuss today. Now, as many of you know by now, the Commission is planning to present the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act in December, actually next week, December 15th, if all goes well. It's a legislative package that will have far-reaching implications for the EU's digital economy and probably beyond. Early drafts of these plans suggest the Commission is going to introduce ex-ante regulation to tame markets characterized by large platforms acting as so-called digital gatekeepers. And this would involve banning some practices by search engines, operating systems, and cloud service providers to address concerns that their practices are unfair to their customers, to their business users, and new market entrants. For example, the Commission may force businesses to share commercial data, ban platforms from giving preferential ranking of their own services, and prohibit sites from automatically signing users into more than one of the services. These regulations could have different impacts on platforms depending on their business models, of course. How can the DSA and particularly the DMA promote and protect competition and innovation in digital markets while preserving consumer choice? To what extent are EU competition rules still fit for purpose? How to identify the scope and who could fall into that scope? To what extent is it really fair or more fair to all to prohibit certain practices? What are stakeholders' expectations of the proposals to be released on December 15th? I have many, many questions. And with me today to discuss this and hopefully more, and thank you all for making some time for us today, we have Ricardo Castanheira, who's Digital Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Portugal to the EU. Thank you for joining. We have Deirdre Clune, a member of the European Parliament for the EPP Group. We have Karel Mask, a senior attorney at Microsoft, and Bartek Teleko, EU Public Policy Manager at Google. Thank you very much to you all. Now, let's perhaps start with you, Deirdre. What, according to you, is really the problem that the Commission has been trying to solve, and what are the objectives of the proposed regulations? And I'm wondering as well, if it seems that we're not trying to define a whole industry, covering it with one standard set of rules. How does that work? How does that make
well, the Commission, I think, they've been vocal about the problems that they are trying to solve, and that's what they believe is that they want more openness and transparency about how the large platforms, now we all know the names that have been bandied around, but how do you measure that, and how do you measure what platforms have influence whereby they can stifle innovation of smaller companies? I think that's probably the words that she's used as well, and has been used by both commissioners, actually. So what she wants to do is to ensure that, well, number one, European businesses can flourish, that we create that innovation isn't stifled. I think that's important, trying to create an European ecosystem for our own SMEs, and then to make sure that there is a fairness, and that what you've mentioned in your opening statement there, Aline, about self-preferencing, with transparency in that smaller businesses aren't discommoded, and that there's a facility whereby you can, an interoperability where you can move from one platform to the other, and that they're not blocked, or really that's the thinking behind it. But we need, and there has been, and the Commission have said that, the current tools available to them aren't fit for the type of issues that they want to address, albeit with the DSA, you're updating the e-commerce directive, and the DMA is then the market tool element of the proposed legislation. So really what I think is a concern that the large platforms are stifling innovation. They're too powerful. But I mean, I think in the Parliament then we'll be looking to see, we'll see the evidence of that as well. I think that's going to be important. People are going to be asking that question. Do we have evidence of it? I think there's lots of concern, lots of statements have been made, but the evidence would be there. We need to be there as well. And just because a particular platform is large, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. It's that because they've been successful in the business model that they operate, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. But if they are, stifling innovation, taking all the space for themselves and not allowing small businesses to establish or to flourish, I think that is a more serious question.
Can I ask you just as a follow-up question? Okay. I know that the EPP released a position on the DSA and DMA. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, and also what are your expectations or maybe your concerns about it?
Well, yeah, the DSA have we get probably similar to what the Commission has said. We want the DSA is clear. We want recognise that the existing legislation has to be upgraded. On protection for consumers would be at the heart of it. More transparency. If decisions are being taken to restrict a particular business or innovation, and why is that? If something is being targeted to consumers, transparency around why are they being targeted, and who's paying for the ad that you get, why are individual businesses being targeted? Just more transparency, I think, is probably the key to it, and putting the consumer at the centre of it, in the fear that their decisions are being taken, and that they're not. Our decisions are being taken, that they don't allow them free choice, that they're not really aware of all of the implications around their purchases of services or goods when they're dealing with larger platforms.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to you, Ricardo. I know that, I think most people know that Portugal is going to take over the EU presidency in January, and maybe you can tell a little bit more to what extent the rules that will be proposed, fit or align with your plan or your priorities for the EU, and to what extent do you think they're likely to, support really something the EU needs, which is to create European platforms that can scale to really make our digital market more competitive?
Well, thank you very much, Eileen, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to touch base once again with you and the other colleagues in the panel. At the heart of the presidency, the incoming Portuguese presidency, digital policy goals, I would say, are at least three main principles, which will broadly guide our national position on the DSA and also on the DMA, which we still don't have. We will play an honest broker role. But anyway, just to emphasize that for us in Portugal, the digital transition is a strong driver of economic recovery, and also a unique opportunity to strengthen the single market. Then we need to see the digital empowerment of citizens and also businesses as a priority, but sustained more and more on a trustworthy and ethical dimensions. The last priority, I would say, or principle of the digital priority is to enhance Europe's role as a global digital reference. And in a nutshell, those three main principles of a big digital priority, we can project that on the discussion, or at least what we expect to be the discussion on the DSA and the DMA. Because as already has been said, we recognize, I think that it's quite specific, clear to everyone, including the industry, that we need, one, to modernize the rules applied to e-commerce. 20 years, there is a lot of things that have been changed, but while keeping and maintaining the core principles, I would say. But with the DSA and the DMA, we cannot also miss the opportunity to set up a forward-looking, for a future-proof regulatory framework for the online arena. It's quite interesting to see and remarkable how so many entities from non-EU countries, for example, responded to the public consultations launched by the Commission. Entities from the United States, from Japan, from Australia, from Israel, which give us a clear idea on how important is the discussion and how Europe can be or is already a front runner from a regulatory perspective. What we think is the DSA will be for sure the first comprehensive regulation of digital services, and the DMA, as we've heard already, on the DMA, I think that we should focus on reaching a fair market conditions, and especially a trading environment for the small, medium companies, European companies, and also for the startups. This is very important for a country like Portugal, where we are a very pro-startup nation and a pro-digital country.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I ask you a question about something rather recent that we've heard from the UK antitrust regulator. They recently gave an advice about how to, effectively monitor digital competition. I came with a bunch of ideas and proposals, and that's okay if you prefer not to answer, but I was wondering if you have an idea of whether, to what extent the Commission's proposals might be similar or, inspired from this.
I would love to say something about that, but unfortunately, we don't have that kind of information, Eileen. We are based on, I would say, it's quite academic exercise to speculate and what we think that it can be, but unfortunately, I cannot answer to your question.
Very wise. All right, then. I'm going to move to Bartek and Carol on behalf of Google and Microsoft. Thank you both for joining us. For industry perspective, now I've heard Werner Steng of the Commission say in one panel, yet another panel about the DMA and the DSA, that it was important that the defined scope of the DMA, it's important that it should be narrow enough to avoid unintended consequences, but it should be wide enough to be future-proof. And I was wondering, perhaps starting with you, Bartek, whether you agree, whether you think the scope should be broad, narrow. What should be also the right criteria to capture that scope? The threshold for determining gatekeepers will be mainly quantitative, we hear, but should there be also qualitative criteria or both? Just wanted to pick your brains on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Aline, and thanks for having me today. So basically, the gatekeeper definition question is going to be a crucial one for us. On the one hand, we're quite lucky because no matter what the threshold will be, we think we're going to end up in scope. So we are in this comfortable situation. But, that being said, we think that the definition and the Commission should be nuanced in its approach. So what we mean by that is that, you asked the question about the CMA and their recommendations on how to define gatekeepers. So the direction that they are taking is quite interesting because they propose to focus on specific activities of companies rather than on companies themselves. So this is a crucial point for us because, if you want to define Google as a gatekeeper through the search prism, obviously, we're going to be in scope. Google Search is a fairly popular product, and there's no way around it, right? But if you look at different activities, different things that we bundle with search, such as Google Maps, again, Maps is a fairly popular product. But if you look at things like flights, for example, right? That's an interesting one where we see a lot of strong competition coming from European companies. Plenty of opportunities there for people who want to book their flights online. Skyscanner, kayak.com, Fly for Free, kiwi.com. These are the names that come to mind to a European consumer if they want to book a flight online, not really Google Flights, right? So if we think, that this is important to define gatekeepers through this prism of the specific activities, because I think from the consumer perspective, it is actually quite beneficial that Google is trying to expand into this new market. And, we're expanding the consumer choice in this particular case. So this is the approach that, we would like to see hopefully in the Commission proposal to avoid the unintended consequences that you talked about?
Yeah, thank you. Because there are, I've read, sorry, an interview of Google's Europe president, Matt Britton, who warned about data use concerns and how particularly prohibiting certain practices could be detrimental to certain services and impact negatively consumers and businesses. And, there could be also legal complications arising from a ban on self-preferencing practice. Could you elaborate on this, just to tell a little bit more concretely, what does that mean for me as a user? How could that impact me? And also, how could that affect the competitiveness of a business user?
Sure. So in terms of, what we are looking at here is what the Commission will put on the table in terms of the unfair practices and which of those are going to be banned effectively. So a couple of months ago, I believe we all saw this leaked document with practices that we could all see. What really attracted our attention was, a ban on self-preferencing. So the way we interpret it is, in case of search and maps, for example, it's basically rolling back innovation by 10, 15 years, because if you remember Google from 10 years ago, when you entered a query, a physical address, we didn't really show you Google Maps because there wasn't Google Maps back then. There are 10 blue links. But, as the search evolves and as we saw, people looking more and more for, directions on the internet, how to get from point A to B, we decided to roll out this new innovative feature, which is Google Maps, basically. Now, if we can do self-preferencing, this is exactly what it will result in, coming back to 10, 15 blue links. So basically coming back in time 10, 15 years ago. Now you need to ask yourself a question, which version of Google do you prefer? The one that we have today or the one from 10, 15 years ago? But this is basically our fear, that if we go too wide, if we're not precise enough in terms of defining gatekeepers and, their activities, this is what we can see in terms of possible unintended consequences.
Thing you very much. Turning to you, Carol. Now, Microsoft is also involved in this discussion, but those who know, we don't put you in the same bucket as perhaps other platforms for different reasons, and we probably will talk about how business models can be very different. So can you tell us a little bit more about why is Microsoft interested in this discussion? Why was it important for you to get involved, and whether you share the idea that there's an agreement among online platforms that some regulation is needed, or whether you think some companies could benefit or suffer from it?
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a great discussion. It's actually great to have this discussion before the launch, so we can speak a little bit more freely about what we think. And I'm not yet as much narrowed down, but I think what I heard before, I couldn't agree more with Bartek on the notion that we need to have some focus in the discussion. But to go back to your question and answer that first. Microsoft is obviously in that because even 16 years ago, we had the first case, kind of digital case or IT case in that area, and it's still the most quoted case, and it seems to follow us, even though technology has moved on, Microsoft has moved on, these markets have moved on quite significantly. So since I joined the company at the time, I'm still interested in that kind of discussion. But on a more serious note, we think there are concerns, and we need to address those concerns. I think that's where the kind of a broad consensus is. The question then comes, what and how, and that's a lot it's really a multi-million-dollar question, not just in terms of revenues for European companies, for US companies, for everyone in the industry, for consumers, what that means to the products they will see tomorrow. So since we want to continue to play in the digital world, since we have platforms ourselves, since we will be subject to the same rules as everyone else, and maybe we also, depending on how you define gatekeepers, might have some products or services that are kept. We definitely want to be in that discussion, and we want to contribute to the discussion with the experience we have from the old cases, what worked and what didn't work, but also to provide our perspective on, how can you focus this discussion? I mean, when I heard the introductory statements and the things, what this is about, I know everything is about the consumer. Yes, everything is about European industry. Yes, everything is about everything digital, and everyone goes somewhere digital. If you aren't there yet, you are already late in the game. So it's about everything. And that's becoming a little bit of worrying proposition if we really want to cover everything. So let's, be clear about what we are trying to achieve. Is it that we want to protect innovation? Is it that we want to protect competition? Is it that we want to protect European companies? Is it, anyone's personal agenda? Let's make that clear. Let's put that on the table. I think the Commission has done real soul searching and trying to collect all the concerns, and has now the tough task to select between those they want to tackle and those they can't. Or and I hope we can contribute a little bit to the discussion by providing our perspective, what we think is problematic, and help to shape something which actually achieves its objective. We have been subject to some form of decisions where we ourselves at times questioned how it helped ultimately these markets, and that's the devil in the detail, where you need, or where we hope we can contribute some experience, some expertise.
Thank you very much. I have one or two follow-up questions. Could you comment on maybe how market investigation tools could be useful to identify what is being called platforms? And I have another question, which is more about some of the practices that would be prohibited in the leak that we saw, like exclusivity, or to what extent are they covered by existing regulations? Is there evidence that there needs to be more intervention? We have the P2B regulation. Maybe there are some effects there. Maybe there's some things that are covered as well. Maybe if you could comment on that.
Yeah, happy to do so. I think the concern which is being raised, and answering your question, what's covered or not, I mean, to a large extent, the more I'm getting into this discussion about platform regulation, I start to appreciate how good existing antitrust laws were in terms of clearly identifying where you have intervention with free trade and entrepreneurial innovation, and where not. But we realized that there is beyond dominance and beyond anti-competitive agreements and beyond mergers that we somehow need to control, areas where they could rise, where there could be concerns, and they are happening a lot in some of the digital markets. It's not the digital industry, I would say, but it's there is a certain gap when you are looking at effects which current competition rules can't control, and they might be behavioral, they might be network effects, and the like. And that's an area to explore. Coming back, to market investigation tool, it seems, or rumor has it, that there has been a little bit of cutback on that front. But I'm personally all for market investigations because of the challenges of these sectors. We have been for years subject of an investigation, and people try to look closer at our practices. Other big tech companies are subject to scrutiny as well, and we need to have that discussion. We need to look more closely into the business models, understand them fully, and then think about the practices we are concerned about. So I think that's a helpful process. I would hope that process is feeding into what is then more a regulation type, ex ante regulatory instrument, blacklist, graylist, whitelist, or just a blacklist. But if that's built on the experience we have, I think we are on a good path because we know what we wish for. As opposed to a situation by broadening this out and venturing with, a very, with a prescription drug, start using that in the supermarket, and everyone who thinks, it might be the appropriate drug is self-medicating. So going deep, I think there's a lot of value to that, and market investigation tool might help to do that.
Thank you very much. I've been, hearing here and there that, or reading here and there that maybe our competition tools and our antitrust tools are not, maybe they should be modernized because the way they understand competition on the digital market, that kind of competition cannot necessarily be assessed the way it is on other markets. I don't know whether anyone would want to comment on that, including you, Karel, or someone else who may disagree or agree with that. Bartek?
Bartek, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Either of you.
Yeah, very, very quickly, a couple of thoughts from our side, because we're often called out as, an example, Google Shopping takes 10 years and so on and so forth. And it is true, it takes, 10 years. This is definitely the case. But that being said, there's a lot of things that we can actually improve on the competition law side if we look at it. We can, for example, agree that there should be deadlines on investigations, so the decision should not take longer than, X amount of time. I think the CMA in their recommendations, they're proposing 12 months to define, whether a company is a gatekeeper when it comes to certain activity or not. So, we can certainly discuss it. There's other things that we could, bring back and put on the table, interim measures, which was used in one of the Commission's investigation into Broadcom. This, often this is something that, the European Commission hasn't really used much in the last couple of years, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to do it more. We can, make sure that mergers are going to be scrutinized more closely, including non-tangible goods such as data and so on and so forth. There's plenty of things that we can discuss, and there's plenty of avenues where I think competition law could be improved to address some of the concerns that we're discussing today, actually.
Thank you. Anyone else wanted to add anything on this, or should I move on? Moving on.
Yeah, could I just say just on that one? I think it's the statements made by Commissioner saying that it just takes too long. The tools available at the moment, and in fact, the Court of Auditors, the European Court of Auditors, recommended recently you need an overhaul of these investigation measures because they're taking too long and they're just not fit for purpose in the digital age. So I think we have not enough information, but we do have a lot of commentary in that area that it's just not. We don't have the capacity at the moment, so you need to move with the digital age.
Thank you so much. And actually, it's good that you're making the transition, because I was going to get back to you and Ricardo, and so still with you, Deirdre. most of the companies that would be targeted by the legislation would happen to be non-European companies, and I know at the heart of the current proposals and the strategy and the policies, there's really this this push for European autonomy and sovereignty. To what extent do you think, and this is maybe a bit of a provocative question, to what extent do you think the debate over online platforms would have been different if these firms had been European?
Well, I'd like to think we'd have the same debate, because let's face it, in Europe we haven't been as good as our competitors in the US or China. We don't have the large companies, and they have been extremely successful. The American ones in particular, we're so well aware of the US ones here in Europe. So it have been really successful, and I don't think that should be a reason to go after these large companies and call them gatekeepers, or accuse them of being gatekeepers. I don't think that's the reason. And I think one part of all this is we need to create European businesses. We need to have our European, successful digital platforms in the European space. Now, I personally don't think we should do that by killing off the competition or trying to kill. I think if there is unfair competition, it is stifling innovation or creating unfair scenarios for European businesses. Well, I absolutely think that should be addressed, whether or not it's a European company or a US company or a Chinese company. And I think you've seen, if you look at European competition policy and the steps that have been taken in various areas over the many years, they have been really strong. If you look in aviation, in fact, how competition incumbents were perceived to and were blocking situations, so the area was opened up to allow competition. And from that, we've seen the growth of low-cost airlines in Europe. But that's just one example, energy area as well. So I think Europe has demonstrated that can be strong and fair when it comes to competition. And I don't believe that this is about US companies or any other. I think it's about ensuring that we create an ecosystem for European companies, a fair system.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to ask the same question to you, Ricardo. And as a follow-up as well, do you think that the DSA and the DMA, will define global practices for these platforms, or do you expect platforms will operate differently in the EU than anywhere else, or should there be a concern about fragmentation of internet services globally?
Well, I absolutely agree that the goal is to try to reach fair market conditions and a fair trading environment for all the companies, European or non-European, Chinese or Americans. I really do not believe that we are here trying to use, in the worst way for sure, the regulatory exercise to I would say, to create some additional burden to American companies or non-European companies. This is for sure my first statement. Secondly, I really believe that also from some of the meetings that we had, and we have already had dozens with different stakeholders, there are probably also some European platforms that also have practices like and use self-preferencing, which also seek unfair advantages due to their systemic nature, that also have some restrictive terms of use and also some lack of transparency. It means that it's not just about non-EU companies. We've mapped some European companies that also play in a non-competitive manner, I would say. This is very clear to us too. But on the second part of your question, I think that, and it's also linked to something that has been already said, especially by Carol. We don't think that no one size fits all approach. I don't think that the way that we should move on. It means that we are dealing a very different kind of business models and services, which for sure might require some tailored remedies. And also, one very important aspect is, I think that it is the way that the definition of gatekeeper platform is linked also with the blacklist. It means, or the prohibitions, I would say, because if we find a narrow definition, we cannot have a broad list of prohibitions, and vice versa. It means that this is I would say, we need to fine tune the exercise, and it's a very difficult one. But I think, and due to the fact that it has been already 2 times postponed, that the Commission is coming with a very, I would say, a much simple and lighter and much more objective proposal, and not such as we thought that emerged between ex ante and the strong new competition tools. I think that they will probably come up with something that will surprise all of us.
Thank you. That sounds great. It's almost Christmas, and we all love surprises. So thanks for your reactions. I'm going to turn back to Karel and Bartek, maybe starting with you, Bartek. I think Ricardo referred to the fact that some more than just a handful of platforms could fall into the scope, depending on the criteria. Some people would want looser criteria that could also impact more companies, that could include Airbnb and Booking.com. I would say when you change rules in the digital economy, you don't just impact certain players. There's a big chance the entire ecosystem is impacted. But just a question about whether you think, should large platforms be subject to asymmetrical rules? The practices may be similar if you look at what smaller platforms are doing. And if so, if there should be asymmetrical rules, doesn't the EU risks, building up some sort of divisions over the scope, and that would introduce differentiated regulation, and what would be the consequences?
Thanks. I really think this is a great question, and something that we think about a lot. In terms of what platforms are going to be captured by this, I don't think we as Google have much control over it. We would simply like to appeal, that we are judged on the merits. So basically, only because you're big or you might be dominant in certain markets, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. And to complicate things even more, coming back to my example, Google Search and Google Maps, we've got some court rulings in Europe that are actually saying bundling search with maps is pro-competitive and pro-consumer. So, for example, High Court of England and Wales ruled that back in 2016. That what we're doing in terms of bundling those 2 products together is actually pro-competitive and pro-consumer. The way we look at it, is what kind of effect it's going to have not only on the platform ecosystem, but on a wider digital ecosystem in Europe, because business users. So basically, these businesses that do business with us were mentioned here on a number of occasions. So a word on this, because this is an element that I think is quite often overlooked when we discuss the DMA. What kind of secondary effects DMA will have on those businesses that actually cooperate with us? So a tangible example, during COVID, we surfaced a lot of information about restaurants on Google Maps, whether you can take food, whether you can take food takeaway, whether they're open during COVID, whether, their opening hours, and so on and so forth. So we had a lot of voices from these small businesses that they actually, managed to stay afloat thanks to these kind of improvements that we were able to roll out very quickly during COVID-19. this is something that really helped them a lot during the pandemic. Now imagine a theoretical scenario that we cannot bundle search and maps anymore. We're back to where we were 10 years ago, and you're looking for a restaurant near you, and what you're getting is 10 blue links. Now, how likely are you to order food if you need to click through all these links and so on and so forth? So in terms of the economic activity that stem from our businesses and business practices that are sometimes regarded as controversial, there's actually quite a lot of economic gain, economic benefits that those businesses, especially small European businesses, are making. So we did a study recently which showed that basically Google products such as maps and surfacing the small businesses, local businesses, restaurants, flower shops, and so on and so forth, it actually generated 180 billion euros last year in economic activity for these businesses in Europe, thanks to us, being able to show them on our maps, thanks to them, being able to advertise with us, and so on and so forth. So this is also something that we would like to draw the attention of the regulators to.
Thank you. Maybe, Cara, you'd like to comment on that, and also, then tell us how then, how would banning some practices preserve consumer welfare? I wanted to ask you, or one of you, to react to what I've read that Commissioner Breton said, that there's a feeling in Brussels that online platforms have become too big to care. But is that the right language to use when we're talking about businesses whose, some practices have been around in other sectors and they're not illegal? There's, some of them are common in other sectors. Like if you think of department stores and supermarkets, they've acquired old-fashioned retailers. They're putting their own brands on their shelves so that consumers can see them more. And that hasn't led to regulatory upheaval. So why is it different this time?
I would say the concerns are real, and would like to come back to the discussion from the beginning, what the objectives are. If it's just the size of the companies, let's talk about that and have a democratic discussion whether we think some companies are too big and we need to do something about it. But I think that's not at the core of the concern. The concern is indeed the impact some of these business models have, not just on European companies, but everyone else in the marketplace. And that needs, from my perspective, an in-depth analysis, because a lot of these practices are obviously ambiguous. There are, all the advantages Bartek's explains, for some businesses. And there are maybe some disadvantages for other businesses as they compete. And what's different in digital markets is that we see situations which we don't see as much in other markets, where we have, winner takes all effects, and we have, in certain areas, just one player. That doesn't mean that competition doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that they are behaving badly and excluding everyone from their core services. But obviously, they would do anything to defend this core area. And we need to find rules which, draw the line about practices which you can engage in to improve your products, which are good and are helpful for the consumers, provide new experiences, innovation. They might venture into markets and foreclose others and revolutionize certain businesses, that's clear, from the practices which are clearly, just protecting their businesses, don't have pro-competitive effects. That's a very fact-based analysis. It's a business model-based analysis. You need to know these markets. You need to listen to a lot of people to understand that fully. And we might find out that a lot of these practices, which everyone says, self-preferencing, kind of an obvious candidate, why don't you prohibit it? And then you hear people like Andreas Mund, who's heading the Federal Cartel Office in Germany, saying, wow, and then we have to decide what self-preferencing is. And we are not so sure we know what that is. And yeah, you know, and it took the Commission a couple of years to figure out, you know, whether certain ways Google is running their business is self-preferencing or not. The jury is still out. And it might come out in any different way. So all I'm saying is these are, I mean, a lot of times these are not easy questions. I think we learned over the past 10, 15 years a lot about the digital economy. I think we have heard a lot of views, and it's good that we have the discussion now, because I guess citizens expect, you know, politicians to act and do something. But let's not, you know, kind of, yeah, too much politicize this, but let's, you know, go back and look at the facts and decide, is it really clear cut? What are the trade-offs? And let's be clear about the trade-offs and discuss these trade-offs. Maybe we want to have some trade-offs. Maybe we are saying, you know, Google search as it exists right now, we are happy to give that up for having more competition around maps or some other services. But then let's have that discussion, as opposed to hiding behind, you know, kind of a buzzword of, you know, like self-preferencing. Let's prohibit self-preferencing. We are prohibiting a lot of other things when we are doing that. And I hope, you know, as soon as we have a proposal and know what we are talking about, I hope indeed that the blacklist is cut back, because when I read the leaked version, you know, I saw interoperability, data access, all these things which took years to figure out, where some people in the industry but by now still don't know what interoperability actually is and what it means and how far it's necessary and whether you really need it and what the impact is on competition and other market participants. You know, think about, you know, what does interoperability to multi-homing? You know, it entrenches your market position the same way as it might open it up. Yeah, you know, by using Facebook to communicate to any other platform and make them interoperable, you might no longer need to use other platforms, because there are no newcomers having a chance to come up, because everything is interoperable. They don't benefit anymore from the same network effects, you know, the incumbent players do. And you need to have these, you know, these trade-offs in mind, and need to provide a clear discussion and an open, transparent discussion about the trade-offs you are deciding on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's also some things like data portability. It's a great thing, but sometimes we forget to look at what kind of costs that involves. And thanks for making the point that, you know, we're looking at this timetable that's challenging, and it seems that there's a rush to define things while the analysis should be maybe more sophisticated. So, and that there's if I take it from your comments, that, you know, we're maybe putting the cart before the horse, as we say. And maybe I'd like to turn to Amelie Kuhn and Ricardo Castanera one more time. I have some questions from participants as well, but do you also agree that maybe we could have benefited, or there could have been more sophistication with this reflection around competition on digital markets, and really when we consider the costs of the regulation? Someone on Slido was asking, you know, to consider that we maybe irreversibly redefine the EU digital market. Maybe Deirdre, you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, I agree with what a lot of Carl has just said too. I think in terms of policymakers or politicians, and we really don't, maybe it's a business we don't understand, and very few people understand it, I say, to the full extent. So we have to be very careful. And I know I said it at the beginning, and I think lots of us would agree that it's about putting the consumer at center, and that's fair enough. But if the consumer realized, we were having a discussion whereby, as Bartek said, they'd probably go back 10, 15 years to where they'll have 12 links. That's not what the consumer wants, because they absolutely value the freedoms and the services and that they're getting now. So I think it's a really important consideration. Are we going to throw, to use an expression, the baby out with the bathwater in this and be left? What are we going to be left with? So I think we have to be really careful on it. And at the same time, I do want to ensure that there is a balance there, and that if it's an unfair marketplace, and I don't blame the large platforms, because they are the best at it, and that's a good thing. Just because you're big doesn't mean that it's bad. And I think we can certainly admire it and what has happened, and the services that are available to consumers. But at the same time, if there are areas that do, as I say, stifle innovation, and that do, well, to use self-preferencing, is it right? What do we mean by that? And is it unfair to competition? Is it anti-competitive? You use the expression or the comparison to the large supermarket, and you can go in there and you know, own brands, own products are on the shelves. Consumer can choose freely others, or maybe not if they're on the top shelf or the bottom shelf. But then at the same time, will be another large supermarket, you know, within the locality where consumer can go also. So I think it is supermarket is a comparison, but at the same time there are alternatives for the consumer as well. So the competition is, as we know, really, really complicated. I think we've all have probably an understanding of it, but at the same time, when you get into the legalities and actually, are you doing the right thing or not? I think it's going to be very, very challenging for us, and we need to tread carefully and make sure that we don't create or that there aren't unintended consequences that would be to the detriment of the consumer, and in that I include small businesses as well.
Thank you. That's a call for caution. Ricardo, would you like to come in?
Yep, indeed. It's very interesting to see that during the last 2 months in the meetings that we've had, several entities, especially those representing the startups, app developers, small tech players, they were calling for the risks of for example, the prohibited practices, because some anti-competitive practices are simultaneously pro-competitive practices. And as I've mentioned, those entities representing the very small tech players, they are quite afraid of unintended consequences of setting a list of prohibitions and also setting a list of obligations, because they also benefit a lot from and they are highly dependent on those gatekeeper ecosystems. Said that, it's just to show how very complex is this exercise, and what is needed is we need to move on with legislative proposals evidence-based. I would say we really need to understand all the details of the different industries, and especially the very different business models that are behind this kind of undetermined concept of a digital platform, or more than that, a gatekeeper platform. Said that, it's quite complex. It's very complex, I would say. But the fact that it's complex does not mean that we should not try to move on or do something, because we have plenty of situations and very concrete examples on how there is really a lack of a level playing field in Europe. And that's, I would say, the big goal to start this kind of regulatory exercise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to try to pick some questions from our participants, and I believe there are a couple of those that would go to you, MEP Clune. So someone is asking, I know we've discussed how it doesn't necessarily mean singling out US big tech, but the question is, do you think singling out US tech in the DMA can result in tensions between the EU and the Biden administration? And there was another such question, more or less related, about the impact of the DSA and the DMA when we're talking about trade and globalized e-commerce.
Well, no, I don't think, I mean, I'd go back to the point I made. I don't think it's necessarily because these large companies, these large successful platforms are US. In fact, we've seen moves as well in the US in the antitrust area. So I think they have their own thoughts on that. But I do think, I mean, it's a bit like when somebody mentioned before, at a previous discussion around about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. I mean, Europe was a front runner there, and it was criticised, and it would leave Europe behind. But now I think many areas look to Europe and how that has benefit consumers and address consumers' concerns. So, no, I don't think it will. I think if we approach it in a fair manner, I think there'll be others looking to us as well as how we do it. And see, the UK are moving, have been advised to move in a similar direction as well, and they'll be maybe not. Well, they will be outside Europe at the end of this month. But no, I think it won't. And if it's fair and open, I'm confident that there won't be differences of opinion, and it won't affect trade or trade relationships.
Thanks. Maybe, Ricardo, you have a reaction given, Portugal's presidency is starting as the Biden administration will start.
Well, I don't think that there is a strong link because, of course, I had to have at least a very optimist vision. I think that there is a new cycle that will start, not exactly from the scratch, but I think that there are a lot of opportunities. And for sure, we in Europe, we will come up with a strong digital agenda, and the United States, they will do more or less the same. But just in a very, very brief words, just to give some light to what will be beyond the digital services package, the DSA, the DMA, what you can expect from us during the next month is, I think that it's also very important, and it's in line with your question, Eileen. We aim to really contribute for the discussion around data and the free flow of data, enhancing the access and sharing of data in the single market. And it is connected with the Data Governance Act discussion that already started, but also the one that will start after our presidency, the Data Act. We want also to put a lot of light on the discussions around digitalization of public administration, public services. We will do something around this. We expect the framework for AI by March, and we will for sure give a lot of attention, at least during the second half of our presidency, to that proposal. And also, it's important to note the new European digital identity, which is for sure something that can be a milestone. And in a country like Portugal, where we've developed already very, very good and very positive examples on using our national digital identity, I think that we expect to also get very positive outcomes on that discussion. Last but not the least, just to tell you that international connectivity will be at the core of our presidency. We really believe that to enhance the digital single market, we need to reinforce the relationships between Europe and the other regions of the world. And normally it must be done exactly through a strong international connectivity network. And for example, just for you to know, we will inaugurate the first submarine cable that ties South America and Europe during our presidency. This is something that it will be a very important momentum during our presidency. And also two last big goals, I would say. An European digital model based, as I've told you, more on rights and with an ethical dimension, which need to be emphasized. And last but not the least, a strong support for entrepreneurship and the European startups. And we are working with the Commission to set up a European startup standard, I would say, which will come up during our presidency too.
Interesting. And I see that 2021 will be everything but boring for you and so for us. Thank you for recalling those priorities. I know it's sort of time, but I wanted to first mention just a few questions just like that from our audience, and then ask you with the last round if there's one message that you could still send to the Commission before they publish the DMA DSA, what would that be? But some participants had questions that, for instance, what about the external outside EU impact of the DSA and the DMA when it comes to trade? That I think we've covered. Should it look into regulating the issue of counterfeit products on e-commerce platforms? And then, someone was saying whether instead of the DMA we should pursue the DEM, deregulated the European market, which was, I suppose, a funny comment. And then one person was wondering about the impact of on big tech as a business, whether they can expect lower revenues or margins. So if you want to react on any of those questions, please do. But your last intervention can also just be that one message you'd like to share. Thank you. Starting with MEP Cluno.
All right. Well, you threw a lot of questions there. I think we'd answered a lot of them. And on the counterfeit products, I hope that the DSA will recognise, will deal with that issue. Be looking to that. I mean, from my point of view, to the Commission, if we're going to come up with proposals, they need to be backed up by it needs to be evidence-based. We'll be looking for that and make sure that how we move forward, that we don't have unintended consequences. I think that would be very important. At the same time, the balance of allowing a European system, digital system, to develop. A tall order maybe, but I think if we keep the balance and not just go after big for the sake of big, I think that I would be really, I think that's important. But ensure that we can create this ecosystem where European digital services can develop.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe Ricardo.
The message to the Commission is good luck. Good luck. They need luck. We all need luck, but especially them. Good luck. Regarding the counterfeited and also not just the counterfeited goods, but also the online piracy, it must be tackled because nowadays with the pandemic, we are of course realizing how the number of counterfeiting and dangerous products out online is increasing. And of course, current measures don't seem to be working effectively. I hope that it's going to be tackled during the DSA discussion.
Thank you. Karel.
I love this discussion. I look forward to continuing this. It's a very, very interesting topic. I mean, I have been antitrust lawyer for a long time, and I never liked it as much as currently, where we really think, what's appropriate, what needs to be done in terms of new things. Deirdre, thank you so much. I agree with a lot of the things that you said, and on your point, you are not the expert. I know you are not, but we are, and we are there to help. I think all the tech firms, everyone in the process is thinking very seriously and engaged in this, and happy to help to think through these issues. These are extremely difficult issues. I couldn't agree more with Ricardo on wishing the Commission luck. It's a very difficult project, and it's not just a difficult project coming up with the rules, but then making sure also that the processes work, that the implementation functions properly. So there's a lot to be done, I think, for all of us. But I'm excited to engaging in this process and being part of that.
Thank you. Bartek, you have the last word.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to repeat what Ricardo has said. Good luck to the Council and to the Parliament, because whatever the Commission will come up with, you're going to have quite a lot of work with this. So good luck. The second thing is, when you work on this, please keep in mind, the unintended consequences. So think wider than GAFAM. I know it's not, targeted at the US companies and so on and so forth, but we all know we're going to end up in scope. So it is important when you regulate to think wider and beyond GAFAM, because the unintended consequences for businesses and consumers might really be severe.
Thank you. And one more time, thank you all so much for your time. Great speakers today. It was a very invigorating discussion. And, I guess we're at the end of the first gestation period, so we look forward to the release of the DSA and DMA. This conversation doesn't stop there. Karel will be happy about this. As often in tech policy, it doesn't stop there. Thank you all for following us today, also throughout this year. It's been really a pleasure to sort of meet each of you on various occasions that way. And just in case you haven't had enough of us this year, you can tune in tomorrow for my colleague Holland's event. She will discuss access to supercomputing with super panelists at 12:30 p.m. ET or 6:30 p.m. CET. 2020, so you can still register and watch tomorrow. Now, wishing you all good luck as well to go through next week's stuff, and hopefully a relaxing break after all this, after this weird year. Thank you so much, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.